Ren Holloway had always been the kind of person who preferred the shadows to the spotlight. At Roosevelt High School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, she moved through the hallways like a ghost, her slight frame and naturally quiet demeanor making her nearly invisible to most students. Standing barely 5'2" with mousy brown hair that she kept tied back in a simple ponytail, Ren looked like she might blow away in a strong wind. Her oversized sweaters and faded jeans hung loose on her petite frame, giving her the appearance of a child wearing her older sister's clothes. She had a habit of keeping her eyes downcast when walking between classes, her worn canvas messenger bag, slung across her shoulder, weighted down with textbooks that seemed almost too heavy for someone her size to carry. The morning routine was always the same. Ren would arrive at school exactly 15 minutes before the first bell, entering through the south entrance where fewer students congregated. She had mapped out the quietest routes between her classes during her first week, memorizing which hallways were less crowded at different times of the day, which bathrooms were usually empty during lunch period, and which corners of the library offered the most privacy during study hall. It was a carefully orchestrated dance of invisibility that she had perfected over the years, a survival mechanism that had served her well in 3 different schools across 2 states. What nobody at Roosevelt High knew was that Ren had spent the last 8 years of her life training in Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at her uncle's dojo back in Portland, Oregon. Her uncle, Marcus Holloway, was a former Marine Corps Force reconnaissance operator who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning home with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a collection of scars that told stories he rarely shared. The dojo he operated out of a converted warehouse in Portland's industrial district wasn't the kind of sleek, commercial martial arts studio that catered to suburban families looking for after-school activities for their children. It was a no-frills training facility where serious practitioners came to learn real-world self-defense, where the mats were stained with years of sweat and the heavy bags bore the impressions of thousands of strikes. Marcus had insisted Ren learn to defend herself after her parents' messy divorce when she was 10 years old. The divorce had been particularly brutal, with her father David leaving not just the marriage but the state entirely, relocating to Phoenix with his secretary, and leaving behind a mountain of debt and a daughter who blamed herself for not being enough to make him stay. Her mother, Sarah, had fallen apart in the months that followed, cycling through jobs and relationships with a desperation that frightened 10-year-old Ren more than her father's abandonment had. It was Marcus who had stepped in, who had driven the 6 hours from Portland to Seattle every weekend to check on his brother's abandoned family, who had found Ren hiding in her bedroom closet during one of her mother's screaming matches with a boyfriend whose name she couldn't even remember. "You can't control what other people do," Marcus had told her during that first conversation in his truck outside her mother's apartment complex, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel as he chose his words carefully. "But you can control how you respond to what they do. And you can make sure you're never helpless when someone tries to hurt you or the people you care about." The training had started simply enough. Basic stretches and conditioning exercises in the small apartment Marcus maintained above his dojo, learning how to fall properly, how to breathe under stress, how to maintain awareness of her surroundings. Marcus was a patient instructor, understanding that his niece was dealing with trauma that went far deeper than just learning physical techniques. He incorporated meditation and breathing exercises into their sessions, teaching her how to find calm in the center of chaos, how to think clearly when adrenaline flooded her system, how to make rational decisions when her fight-or-flight response tried to take control. As the months turned into years, the training became more sophisticated. Ren learned the fundamental principles of Krav Maga, how to use an attacker's size and strength against them, how to target vulnerable points on the human body with maximum efficiency, how to create distance and escape opportunities even when grabbed or restrained. Marcus taught her that martial arts wasn't about looking impressive or collecting belt ranks. It was about surviving encounters with people who wished her harm and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came later, when Ren was 13 and had developed enough physical coordination to understand the complex ground fighting techniques. Marcus brought in a training partner, Elena Rodriguez, a former police officer who had transitioned into private security work and had earned her black belt in BJJ while working patrol in some of Portland's roughest neighborhoods. Elena was barely 5'4" herself, and she became living proof to Ren that size didn't determine the outcome of a physical confrontation when technique and preparation were applied correctly. In jiu-jitsu, you learn to be comfortable. Being uncomfortable, Elena would say during those long Saturday training sessions, her voice calm even as she demonstrated a chokehold that would render someone unconscious in seconds. You learn that being smaller can be an advantage if you know how to use leverage and positioning. Most importantly, you learn that there's always a way out of a bad situation if you stay calm and keep thinking. The dojo became Ren's sanctuary during the turbulent years of her adolescence. While her mother cycled through jobs and relationships, searching for stability she never quite found, Ren found consistency in the rhythm of training. 3 days a week after school, Saturday morning sessions that stretched into the afternoon, and occasional weekend seminars where Marcus would bring in guest instructors from law enforcement and military backgrounds to teach specialized techniques. She learned about situational awareness, how to identify potential threats before they became immediate dangers, how to position herself in public spaces to maximize escape routes, how to read body language and vocal cues that indicated when someone was preparing to become violent. Marcus taught her about the legal and ethical implications of self-defense, emphasizing that violence should always be a last resort and that goal was never to hurt someone but to stop them from hurting others. By the time she turned 16, Ren had developed into a formidable martial artist despite her unassuming appearance. She could spar with training partners twice her size and hold her own, could break down and escape from virtually any hold or grab, and had developed the kind of reflexes and muscle memory that allowed her to react to threats without conscious thought. But more importantly, she had developed the mental discipline to know when not to use those skills. The strongest person in any conflict, Marcus would tell her during their post-training discussions, isn't necessarily the one who can inflict the most damage. It's the one who has the wisdom to know when force is necessary and the restraint to stop the moment it's no longer needed. Anyone can throw a punch, Ren. Not everyone can choose not to throw that punch when they have every right to do so. The training had become more than just a collection of physical techniques. It had become a philosophy that shaped how Ren approached conflict in all areas of her life. She learned to diffuse tensions through body language and tone of voice, to project confidence without aggression, to set boundaries firmly but without unnecessary confrontation. These skills served her well during her junior year at Lincoln High School in Portland, when she found herself the target of Jessica Martinez, a popular girl whose boyfriend had made the mistake of commenting publicly about how cute Ren looked during a school assembly. Jessica had assembled a group of friends to make Ren's life miserable, spreading rumors about her family's financial problems, excluding her from social events, making cutting remarks about her thrift store clothes and her mother's latest unemployed boyfriend. For weeks, Ren had endured the psychological warfare with the same patient endurance Marcus had taught her to apply to difficult training sessions. She documented the harassment, reported it to teachers and administrators who promised to look into it, and focused on her studies while waiting for the situation to resolve itself naturally. The resolution had come when Jessica made the mistake of cornering Ren in an empty classroom after school, bringing along 2 of her friends for moral support as she delivered what was supposed to be The Final Humiliation, a detailed recounting of everything that was wrong with Wren's life, her family, and her prospects for the future. But instead of the tearful breakdown Jessica had expected, Wren had simply stood there with perfect posture and calm breathing, absorbing the verbal assault with the same composure she brought to training sessions, where instructors shouted at her while she defended against multiple attackers. When Jessica had finished her performance and stood waiting for some kind of reaction, Wren had simply said, "Are you done now?" in a tone so level and unbothered that it completely deflated the entire confrontation. Jessica's friends had exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware that they were participating in something that made them look petty and cruel rather than powerful and popular. The attempted bullying campaign had ended that afternoon, not because of any physical confrontation, but because Wren had demonstrated that she couldn't be broken by words or social pressure. The training had become her sanctuary, a place where her small size was actually an advantage, where speed and technique mattered more than brute strength. But when her mother remarried Thomas Chen, a soft-spoken accountant she'd met at a grief support group, and they decided to relocate to Iowa for his new job opportunity, Wren had made a conscious decision to leave that part of herself behind. She wanted a fresh start, a chance to be normal, to blend in and avoid conflict altogether. The decision hadn't been easy. Marcus had driven down from Portland for her going-away dinner, and they'd had a long conversation in his truck outside the restaurant while her mother and new stepfather waited inside, giving them privacy for what they all knew might be their final one-on-one conversation for quite some time. "You don't have to hide who you are," Marcus had told her, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what it meant to leave important parts of yourself behind. "The training isn't just about fighting, Wren. It's about confidence, discipline, awareness. Those things don't disappear just because you're not practicing submissions anymore." "I know," Wren had replied, her voice small in the darkness of the truck's cab, "but I'm tired of being the girl who can hurt people. I want to see if I can be the girl who doesn't need to hurt people." Marcus had nodded slowly, understanding better than most the desire to escape from an identity built around violence, even justified violence. "Just remember," he had said finally, "there's a difference between choosing not to fight and being unable to fight. Don't let anyone take away your ability to protect yourself or the people you care about." Now, 3 months into her senior year at Roosevelt High School, Wren was beginning to wonder if her uncle had been right. The decision to hide her martial arts background had been easy to maintain during the first few weeks, when she was still anonymous enough to avoid attention from anyone who might see her as either a threat or a target. But Roosevelt High was one of those sprawling suburban schools that housed nearly 2,000 students. And in a social ecosystem that large and complex, true anonymity was virtually impossible to maintain indefinitely. The building itself was a monument to 1980s educational architecture. Red brick facade, long corridors lined with dented metal lockers, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. The school smelled perpetually of cleaning solution and cafeteria food, with underlying notes of teenage desperation and industrial carpet cleaner. The hallways were wide enough to accommodate the crushing flow of students between classes, but never wide enough to escape the social dynamics that played out in those brief transitions. Roosevelt High operated according to a rigid social hierarchy that had been established over decades and was carefully maintained by each successive generation of students. At the top were the athletes, particularly the football players, followed by the cheerleaders and the students involved in other high-profile sports. Below them were the theater kids and student government representatives, then the various academic clubs and honor society members. Near the bottom were the band geeks, the art students, and the kids who were too smart or too weird to fit into any clearly defined category. And at the very bottom, occupying a social stratum so low it was barely acknowledged, were the invisible kids, the ones who moved through Roosevelt High like ghosts, present but unnoticed, contributing nothing to the social fabric and expecting nothing in return. This was where Wren had deliberately placed herself, and for the first few weeks, the strategy had worked perfectly. She had chosen her classes carefully, avoiding the popular electives that would put her in close proximity to the social elite, opting instead for advanced placement courses that were filled with serious students more interested in college preparation than high school politics. She ate her lunch alone in the library, arrived at school just early enough to avoid the morning social gatherings, and left immediately after her final class to catch the city bus that would take her to the small apartment she shared with her mother and stepfather. The apartment was a significant downgrade from the house they'd lived in back in Portland, but it was clean and quiet, located in a modest complex that catered primarily to young families and retirees. Wren's room was barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a small dresser, but she had arranged it carefully to create a sense of sanctuary. Her few possessions from Portland, books, photos, a small collection of martial arts training manuals that she kept hidden beneath her mattress, were arranged with the same precision Marcus had taught her to apply to her training routines. Thomas Chen had proven to be a surprisingly good influence on her mother. Unlike the series of unstable boyfriends Sarah had cycled through during the years following the divorce, Thomas was reliable, patient, and genuinely committed to building a stable family unit. He worked long hours at his accounting firm, but always made time for family dinners, always asked about Wren's day at school, and had even offered to help her apply for college scholarships, despite having no legal obligation to support her education. Wren appreciated Thomas's presence in their lives, but she also felt the weight of expectation that came with his stability. Her mother was happier than she'd been in years, finally free from the financial stress and emotional chaos that had defined their lives since the divorce. Thomas had made it clear that he considered Wren part of the family he was building with Sarah. But Wren couldn't shake the feeling that her acceptance of this new normal was somehow contingent on her ability to avoid causing problems. This was part of why she'd been so committed to maintaining her low profile at Roosevelt High. The last thing she wanted was to be responsible for disrupting the peace her mother had finally found by getting involved in conflicts that might result in phone calls from school administrators or meetings with parents who were concerned about their children's safety. Wren had seen how quickly stability could disappear when adults started making decisions based on fear and uncertainty. Unfortunately, peace was not something that Blake Morrison was inclined to offer anyone, especially not to quiet new students who seemed like easy targets. Blake stood 6'1", with the kind of athletic build that came from 4 years on the varsity football team and a lifetime of genetic advantages that had made physical dominance feel like a birthright. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled, cut in the kind of expensive fade that required weekly maintenance and suggested parents who viewed their son's appearance as a reflection of their own social status. He wore his Letterman jacket like armor, the patches and pins announcing his accomplishments to anyone within eyeshot. Team captain, all-state linebacker, recipient of a partial scholarship to the state university where he would play football for 4 more years before reality forced him to confront his limitations. Blake had ruled Roosevelt High's social hierarchy since his sophomore year, when a growth spurt and an aggressive weight training regimen had transformed him from just another wannabe tough guy into someone with the physical presence to back up his natural inclination toward cruelty. He had gathered around him a tight circle of followers who eagerly participated in his daily entertainment of making life miserable for anyone he deemed unworthy of his respect, creating a culture of intimidation that permeated every aspect of school life. His most loyal lieutenants were Tyler Santos and Mason Reed, both of whom had found in Blake's friendship the kind of protection and status they could never have achieved on their own. Tyler was a stocky wrestler with dark eyes and a cruel smile, the son of a local mechanic who had always felt inferior to the wealthier families that dominated Roosevelt High's social scene. Wrestling had given him an outlet for his anger and resentment, but it was his association with Blake that had given him real power over his fellow students. He specialized in the kind of physical intimidation that left no visible marks: shoulder checks in the hallway, accidental collisions during lunch periods, the kind of aggressive posturing that made smaller students step aside without a word. Mason Reed was different, a basketball player whose tall, lanky frame and sharp features made him look like a predator even when he was standing still. He came from money, his father a successful real estate developer who had donated generously to Roosevelt High's athletic programs over the years. Mason's cruelty was more psychological than physical, delivered through cutting remarks about clothing, family circumstances, and social status that demonstrated just how much he knew about the private lives of his classmates. He had a talent for identifying exactly what someone was most insecure about and weaponizing that knowledge with surgical precision. Together, the three of them formed a triumvirate of cruelty that had made countless students' lives miserable over the years, always careful to stay just below the radar of teachers and administrators who preferred to look the other way rather than deal with the complications that came with disciplining star athletes. They had perfected a system of harassment that was difficult to prove and even harder to prevent, relying on plausible deniability and the natural reluctance of victims to report incidents that might make their lives even more difficult. The administration at Roosevelt High was complicit in this system, though they would never have admitted it openly. Principal Janet Hendricks had been in her position for 12 years, and she had learned that her job security depended more on maintaining the school's reputation for athletic excellence than on addressing social problems that didn't generate negative publicity. The football team brought in revenue through ticket sales and boosted the school's profile throughout the district, which translated into better funding and more administrative support from the school board. Vice Principal Robert Martinez, who handled most disciplinary issues, had his own son on the varsity basketball team and understood the delicate balance required to maintain order while protecting the athletes who brought prestige to the school. He had developed a system of selective enforcement that allowed him to crack down harshly on obvious troublemakers, while giving star athletes the benefit of the doubt in situations that could be interpreted multiple ways. The teachers, for the most part, had learned to focus on their classroom responsibilities while avoiding the broader social dynamics that made their jobs more difficult. They knew which students were untouchable, which complaints would be taken seriously by the administration, and which situations were better handled through willful ignorance than direct intervention. It was a system that prioritized stability and reputation over justice, and it created an environment where bullying could flourish as long as it didn't disrupt the carefully maintained facade of academic and athletic excellence. Wren's first encounter with Blake's crew happened on a Tuesday morning in early October, 3 weeks after she'd started at Roosevelt. She was at her locker, carefully organizing her textbooks for the day, according to the system she'd developed to minimize the time spent vulnerable in the hallways, when she felt someone slam into her from behind with enough force to send her stumbling forward into the metal doors. Her books scattered across the hallway floor in a cascade of papers and notebooks, the sound echoing off the walls like a small avalanche. She heard the distinctive sound of laughter that she was already beginning to recognize and dread, not the innocent amusement of students who had witnessed something genuinely funny, but the cruel satisfaction of people who found entertainment in others' misfortune. "Oops," Blake said with mock sincerity, his voice carrying just loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. "Didn't see you there, Mouse." Maybe you should eat a sandwich or something so people can actually notice you. The nickname stung more than the physical impact had. Wren had always been small, but the comment about her size felt deliberately chosen to highlight not just her physical appearance, but her social invisibility. She could feel the eyes of other students watching her as she bent down to collect her scattered belongings, some with sympathy, but most with the kind of detached interest people showed when witnessing someone else's embarrassment from a safe distance. "I mean, seriously," Tyler chimed in, his voice loud enough to carry down the hallway. "How does someone that tiny even cast a shadow? It's like she's part ghost or something." Mason's contribution was more subtle, but no less cutting. "Maybe that's why she sits alone at lunch," he said, just loudly enough for Wren to hear as she scrambled to gather her papers. "Hard to make friends when people forget you're there 5 minutes after they meet you." Wren forced herself to remain calm as she collected her things, her face burning with embarrassment as other students stepped around her without offering to help. She could feel Blake and his friends watching her, waiting for a reaction. Tears, anger, some kind of emotional response that would validate their entertainment and justify the next escalation. But Marcus's training had taught her to recognize manipulation tactics, and she understood instinctively that any reaction she gave would only encourage more of the same treatment. She gathered her things quickly and walked away without a word, ignoring the continued snickers behind her. But as she made her way to her first class, she could feel something shifting inside her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a familiar awareness that she was being evaluated by predators who were testing her responses to determine how much abuse she would tolerate before fighting back. The pattern established itself quickly after that first encounter. Blake seemed to have developed an internal radar for finding Wren during the most crowded times of day, when the maximum number of witnesses would be available to observe her humiliation. His approach was methodical and calculated, designed to establish dominance while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by teachers or administrators. In the cafeteria, he would accidentally bump into her while she was carrying her lunch tray, sending food spilling across her clothes and the floor. The first time it happened, Wren had been carrying a bowl of soup and a sandwich, walking carefully through the maze of tables toward the back corner where she usually ate alone. Blake had appeared suddenly, walking directly toward her with his attention apparently focused on something across the room, timing his distraction perfectly to ensure a collision that sent hot soup splashing across her sweater and dripping onto the floor. "God, I'm so sorry," he had said loudly, his voice carrying across the cafeteria as dozens of students turned to witness the spectacle. "You're so small, I literally didn't see you there. Here, let me help you clean that up." But his offer of assistance had been purely performative. By the time Wren had processed what had happened and started to respond, Blake had already walked away, leaving her standing in a puddle of soup with her ruined lunch and the stares of 200 students who now associated her with clumsiness and social incompetence. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the public embarrassment. It was the way other students reacted, or rather failed to react. Wren watched as classmates she'd tried to befriend would suddenly find their phones fascinating whenever Blake's crew approached. Teachers would hurry past during incidents, their eyes carefully averted as if witnessing the bullying might somehow make them responsible for stopping it. The hallway encounters became more frequent and more aggressive as Blake gained confidence in her unwillingness to retaliate. Tyler would shoulder-check her into the lockers while Mason made loud comments about how she should watch where she was going, their timing always perfect to coincide with the chaos of class changes when teachers were focused on getting to their next assignments rather than monitoring student behavior. "Watch it, ghost girl," Tyler would say after slamming her into a bank of lockers, his voice carrying just enough concern to sound like he was worried about her well-being. "You gotta be more careful walking around here. Someone your size could get seriously hurt if you're not paying attention." The nickname Ghost Girl, caught on quickly, spreading through Roosevelt High's social network with the efficiency that only high school gossip could achieve. Within days, students who had never spoken to Wren were referring to her by the nickname, some with casual cruelty, but others with a kind of uncomfortable sympathy that somehow felt worse than open hostility. The psychological impact was exactly what Blake had intended. Every time someone used the nickname, it reinforced the idea that Wren was barely present, that her existence at Roosevelt High was so minimal it could be dismissed or ignored without consequence. She began to notice students looking through her during conversations, teachers forgetting to call on her in class, even cafeteria workers seeming surprised when she appeared at the lunch counter, as if they hadn't expected her to need food like a real person. The systematic nature of the harassment became clear during her 4th week at Roosevelt High, when she realized that Blake's crew had begun coordinating their efforts to maximize her discomfort. They would take turns approaching her throughout the day, ensuring that she never had more than an hour or two of peace before the next accidental encounter or cruel comment. It was a campaign of psychological warfare designed to keep her constantly on edge, never knowing when the next humiliation might occur. Mason's contributions were particularly insidious because they targeted her family's financial circumstances and social status. He had somehow discovered that she lived in the lower-income apartment complex on the east side of town, that her stepfather drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, that she bought her clothes from thrift stores and discount retailers. These details became ammunition for casual cruelty, delivered with the kind of smile that made it difficult to complain without seeming oversensitive. "Nice jacket, Wren," he would say when passing her in the hallway, his tone suggesting genuine compliment until the follow-up revealed his true intention. "Goodwill or Salvation Army? I can never tell the difference, but you've got such a good eye for finding the vintage pieces." The comments about her appearance were designed to highlight not just her family's limited finances, but her outsider status in a school where social hierarchy was closely tied to material displays of wealth. Roosevelt High served a predominantly middle-class suburban population where students drove their own cars, wore name-brand clothing, and participated in expensive extracurricular activities that required significant parental investment. Wren's thrift store wardrobe and careful budgeting made her stand out in ways that Blake's crew exploited ruthlessly. They would make comments about her unique fashion choices, her creative approach to accessories, her environmentally conscious decision to recycle clothing that other people had discarded. The language was always carefully chosen to maintain plausible deniability, while ensuring that everyone within earshot understood the underlying message about her family's financial limitations. There was one exception to the general indifference Wren encountered from her classmates, though. Zoe Martinez had been one of the first students to actually speak to Wren when she'd arrived at Roosevelt, approaching her during lunch on her 3rd day with a friendliness that seemed genuine rather than performative. Zoe was everything Wren wasn't: confident, outgoing, with long, dark hair that always seemed to catch the light perfectly, and an infectious smile that could transform any conversation from awkward to comfortable within seconds. She was involved in student government as junior class treasurer, had landed the leading role in the upcoming school production of Our Town, and somehow managed to be genuinely popular without participating in the cruel social dynamics that defined so much of Roosevelt High's culture. More importantly, from Wren's perspective, Zoe seemed to exist in a social space that was largely immune to Blake's influence. Her popularity was based on talent, leadership, and genuine likability rather than fear or social climbing, which meant she could afford to be kind to unpopular students without risking her own status. She was protected by the same social dynamics that enabled Blake's bullying, Her involvement in activities that brought positive attention to the school made her valuable to the administration, and her network of friends was too large and too influential to be easily disrupted. "Mind if I sit here?" Zoe had asked during that first lunch encounter, gesturing to the empty chair across from Ren in the back corner of the cafeteria where she always ate alone. "The junior class is meeting after school today to talk about prom planning, and honestly, I need a few minutes of peace before I have to deal with 3 hours of arguments about whether the theme should be Enchanted Garden or Starry Night." Duh! Ren had looked up from her book, a worn paperback copy of The Outsiders that she'd read dozens of times but still found comforting, and nodded silently, uncertain whether this was some kind of elaborate prank or a genuine offer of companionship. But Zoe had settled into the chair with the kind of casual comfort that suggested she was exactly where she wanted to be, unpacking her lunch and launching into a monologue about the absurd politics of prom planning that was both entertaining and refreshingly normal. "I swear you'd think we were planning someone's wedding," Zoe had said, unwrapping a sandwich that looked homemade and infinitely more appealing than the cafeteria food Ren had been eating. "Jenny Walsh spent 45 minutes yesterday arguing about whether we should use real flowers or silk flowers for the centerpieces. Like the fate of civilization depends on getting the decorations exactly right. Meanwhile, nobody wants to talk about booking a DJ or figuring out the ticket prices, the actual important stuff." The conversation had been exactly what Ren needed. Casual, funny, and completely removed from the social dynamics that made every other interaction at Roosevelt High feel like navigating a minefield. Zoe had a gift for making people feel comfortable, asking questions that showed genuine interest without being invasive, sharing stories about her own experiences that created opportunities for connection without demanding reciprocal vulnerability. When the lunch period ended and they'd gone their separate ways, Ren had felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Portland, the possibility of genuine friendship with someone who saw her as a complete person rather than a social liability or a target for entertainment. The friendship had developed gradually over the following weeks, with Zoe continuing to seek out Ren's company during lunch periods and study halls. She would share gossip about the theater department, complain about the impossible demands of her AP classes, and ask Ren's opinion about everything from college applications to family drama with a sincerity that made it clear she valued her perspective. "You're a good listener," Zoe had told her during one of their conversations, settling back in her chair with the kind of relaxed posture that suggested she was exactly where she wanted to be. "Most people at this school just wait for their turn to talk, They're not actually interested in what anyone else has to say. But you really pay attention to people. That's rare." Ren had felt herself blushing at the compliment, unused to having her social skills acknowledged in positive terms. At her previous schools, her tendency to listen more than she spoke had been interpreted as shyness or social awkwardness, something to be corrected rather than appreciated. "I guess I've always been more comfortable watching than performing," she had replied, choosing her words carefully. "There's usually more to learn from paying attention to what people don't say than what they do say." "Exactly," Zoe had exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious. "Like yesterday during student government, Michael Henderson spent 20 minutes talking about how we need to revitalize school spirit and create meaningful connections between students. But the whole time he was checking his phone and clearly wasn't listening to anyone else's ideas. Actions versus words, These conversations became the highlight of Ren's days at Roosevelt High, providing a refuge from the constant stress of avoiding Blake's crew and maintaining her carefully constructed invisibility. Zoe's friendship offered something she hadn't realized she'd been missing: the opportunity to be seen and appreciated for who she actually was, rather than dismissed or targeted for what she appeared to be. But Wren also noticed how Zoe's expression would tighten with worry whenever Blake's attention turned their way during their lunch conversations. Zoe was brave enough to maintain their friendship and include Wren in conversations with her other friends, but she was also smart enough to recognize the precarious nature of high school social dynamics. She understood that speaking out too forcefully against Blake could easily make her a target as well, and she had too much to lose: her leadership positions, her role in the school play, her college applications, to risk direct confrontation with someone who had the power to make her life significantly more difficult. "Just ignore them," Zoe had advised after witnessing one of Blake's public humiliation sessions in the cafeteria, her voice tight with frustration and concern. "They're just insecure bullies trying to make themselves feel important. Everyone knows Blake peaked in high school, and he's terrified of what happens when he graduates and discovers the real world doesn't care about his football stats." The advice was well-intentioned, but it was also easier said than followed. Blake's campaign of harassment had become more sophisticated and more persistent as the weeks passed, expanding beyond simple physical intimidation to include systematic social exclusion and psychological manipulation. He had begun recruiting other students to participate in the harassment, offering social protection and inclusion to anyone willing to contribute to Wren's isolation. The recruitment was subtle but effective. Blake would make comments about Wren's appearance or behavior within earshot of students who were themselves on the margins of Roosevelt High's social hierarchy, offering them the opportunity to join in the mockery and thereby elevate their own status. The temptation was powerful, the chance to redirect Blake's attention away from themselves while gaining points for participation in his entertainment. Some students resisted, uncomfortable with the cruelty, even if they weren't brave enough to actively oppose it. But others eagerly joined in, grateful for the opportunity to feel powerful and included rather than vulnerable and alone. Within a month, Wren found herself dealing not just with Blake's inner circle, but with a broader network of students who had been recruited into the harassment campaign. The expansion of the bullying campaign coincided with the beginning of winter, as November brought shorter days and colder weather that trapped everyone inside the school building for longer periods. The hallways became more crowded and more tense as students spent less time outdoors and more time in the confined spaces where social hierarchies were most rigidly enforced. Wren's careful strategies for avoiding conflict became less effective as the physical spaces she relied on for sanctuary, empty hallways, unused classrooms, quiet corners of the library, became more crowded with students seeking their own refuge from the cold. The bathroom she'd been using to change clothes after gym class was discovered by a group of girls who made pointed comments about her interesting wardrobe choices. The table in the back corner of the cafeteria where she'd been eating lunch was claimed by a group of freshmen who giggled whenever she approached. Even her academic sanctuary was compromised when Blake made a point of signing up for the same study hall period Wren had been using to catch up on homework in peace. He didn't participate in the actual studying, instead using the time to stage elaborate whispered conversations with his friends that were clearly designed for her benefit. "I heard Ghost Girl's family moved here because they got evicted from their last place," he would say, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the room while maintaining the pretense of a private conversation. "Makes sense, right? I mean, look at how she dresses. Definitely screams financial problems to me." The comments weren't true, but truth wasn't the point. Blake understood instinctively that high school social dynamics were powered by perception rather than reality, and that spreading rumors about someone's personal life was often more damaging than any physical confrontation. The whispers followed Wren through the hallways, creating a narrative about her family circumstances that became accepted truth simply through repetition. Tyler's contributions focused on her physical appearance and social isolation, delivered with the kind of mock concern that made it difficult to complain without seeming oversensitive. He would approach her between classes with questions that seemed helpful on the surface, but were designed to highlight her outsider status. "Hey, Ren, are you feeling okay?" he would ask when she was standing alone at her locker. "You look really pale today. Are you eating enough? I know your family probably has to budget pretty carefully, but there are programs at school that can help with lunch costs if you need them." The offer of assistance was purely performative, designed to draw attention to her financial circumstances while maintaining the appearance of benevolent concern. Other students would overhear these conversations and draw their own conclusions about Ren's family situation, adding to the narrative of poverty and social inadequacy that Blake's crew was constructing around her. Mason's approach was more sophisticated, focusing on her academic performance and social connections in ways that undermined her confidence while appearing to offer genuine advice. He would approach her after classes where she'd performed well, offering comments that seemed congratulatory until the underlying message became clear. "Nice job on that presentation in American history," he would say, his tone suggesting genuine admiration until the follow-up revealed his true intention. "You're really smart, you know that. It's too bad you're so shy. I bet you could be really popular if you just put yourself out there more. Maybe join some clubs, make some friends, get involved in school activities. Of course, that probably costs money, right? And time away from whatever job you're probably working to help your family pay rent." These interactions were calculated to chip away at her self-esteem while appearing to offer constructive feedback. Mason understood that the most effective psychological manipulation came disguised as helpful advice, creating self-doubt while maintaining plausible deniability if anyone questioned his motives. For 6 weeks, Ren endured this systematic campaign of harassment with gritted teeth and careful self-control. Every instinct her uncle had trained into her screamed at her to fight back, to show these bullies that she wasn't the helpless victim they assumed her to be. During her solitary evenings in the apartment she shared with her mother and stepfather, she would practice the techniques Marcus had taught her, running through defensive combinations and visualizing scenarios where she might need to protect herself. But she forced herself to remember why she'd chosen this path of non-violence. She wanted to be normal, to prove to herself that she could solve problems without violence, that she could build a life that didn't revolve around her ability to hurt other people. Her mother was happier than she'd been in years, finally free from the financial stress and emotional chaos that had defined their lives since the divorce. Thomas had made it clear that he considered Ren part of the family he was building with Sarah, and the last thing she wanted was to jeopardize that stability by getting involved in conflicts that might result in phone calls from school administrators or meetings with concerned parents. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late November, when the weather had turned bitter cold and most students were bundled up in heavy coats and jackets as they moved between buildings. Ren had been walking to her last class of the day, her mind focused on the weekend homework assignment she needed to complete when she heard Zoe's voice behind her, raised in obvious distress. "Stop it, Blake. Just leave me alone." The tone of panic in Zoe's voice sent ice through Ren's veins. She turned to see Blake cornering her friend near the entrance to the gymnasium, with Tyler and Mason flanking him like bodyguards, their positioning clearly designed to block the view of passing students and teachers while creating an intimidating presence that discouraged intervention. Blake had apparently decided that Ren's friendship with Zoe made her a legitimate target for his attention, and he was standing uncomfortably close to her, using his superior height and bulk to create a sense of physical menace that made Zoe look even smaller than usual. His usual mask of casual cruelty had slipped, revealing something darker and more predatory that made Ren's training instincts flare to life for the first time in months. "Come on, Zoe," Blake was saying, his voice carrying that fake friendly tone that everyone at Roosevelt High had learned to fear. "I'm just asking why you waste your time with freaks like Ghost Girl over there. Someone like you could be hanging out with people who actually matter. People who could make sure you have a really great senior year, if you know what I mean." The implied threat was unmistakable. Blake was using his social position and physical presence to pressure Zoe into abandoning her friendship with Ren, and the suggestion that he could influence her senior year carried implications about everything from social acceptance to college recommendation letters that teachers and administrators who valued their relationships with star athletes might be willing to provide. "Ren is my friend," Zoe replied firmly, though Ren could hear the tremor in her voice as she tried to maintain her composure in the face of Blake's intimidation. "And she's worth 10 of you." Blake's expression darkened at the rejection, his mask of casual friendliness disappearing entirely as he processed the fact that his social status and implied threats weren't having the desired effect. Ren felt her stomach clench with a familiar combination of anger and dread as she recognized the shift in his demeanor. She'd seen that look before, in other bullies at other schools, and she knew it meant the situation was about to escalate beyond simple verbal harassment into something that could have serious physical consequences. "You know what I think?" Blake said, his voice dropping to a lower register that carried undertones of genuine menace. "I think you need better friends. Maybe I should help you with that." He reached out to grab the sleeve of Zoe's jacket, his fingers closing around the fabric with enough force to pull her off balance. Zoe stumbled forward with a cry of surprise and pain, her backpack sliding off her shoulder and hitting the floor with a thud that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet hallway. Tyler and Mason moved closer, their positioning creating a tight circle that blocked the view of passing students and teachers, while trapping Zoe in a space where escape would be difficult, if not impossible. The choreography was practiced and efficient, suggesting that this wasn't the first time Blake's crew had cornered someone in this particular location. Ren could see the fear in Zoe's eyes as she tried to pull away from Blake's grip, her usual confidence replaced by the kind of panic that came with the sudden realization that a situation had moved beyond verbal harassment into the realm of actual physical threat. She was looking around desperately for teachers, administrators, or other students who might intervene, but the timing had been chosen carefully to coincide with the period when most faculty members were in their classrooms preparing for the final period of the day. "Let go of me," Zoe said, her voice shaking as she tried to twist away from Blake's hold on her jacket. "You're hurting me." "I'm trying to help you," Blake replied, his tone suggesting wounded feelings even as his grip tightened. "You're making some really bad choices about who you spend time with, and as someone who cares about your future, I feel obligated to point that out." The gaslighting was textbook, positioning his aggression as concern, his intimidation as assistance, his physical restraint as an act of benevolence designed to help Zoe make better decisions. It was the kind of manipulation that left victims questioning their own perceptions and responses, wondering if they were overreacting to what was being presented as helpful guidance. But Ren wasn't confused about what she was witnessing. 8 years of training with Marcus had taught her to recognize predatory behavior in all its forms, and she could see clearly that Blake had moved beyond psychological harassment into the realm of physical assault. His grip on Zoe's jacket, his use of superior size and strength to intimidate and control, his positioning to prevent escape. All of these elements combined to create a situation that met every definition of criminal behavior that Marcus had taught her to identify. More importantly, Zoe was her friend. The only real friend she'd made at Roosevelt High, the only person who had seen past her carefully constructed invisibility to appreciate who she actually was beneath the defensive camouflage. Zoe had taken social risks to include Ren in her life, had offered companionship and genuine kindness when everyone else at Roosevelt High had been content to ignore or abuse her. And now Zoe was in danger because of that friendship. Blake had targeted her specifically because of her association with Wren, had chosen to escalate from harassment to physical intimidation because he saw her loyalty as a challenge to his authority that needed to be crushed before it could inspire others to similar acts of defiance. The calculation was simple and brutal. If Blake could force Zoe to abandon her friendship with Wren through fear and intimidation, it would send a clear message to every other student at Roosevelt High about the consequences of showing kindness to people Blake had marked as acceptable targets. The campaign of harassment would expand and intensify, and Wren's isolation would become complete and permanent. Something inside her chest snapped like a taut wire finally reaching its breaking point. "Hey!" Wren called out, her voice carrying across the hallway with more force than anyone had ever heard from her before. The sound seemed to cut through the ambient noise of student conversations and locker doors slamming, drawing the attention of everyone within a 50-foot radius. Blake turned toward her with an expression of amused surprise, as if a mouse had suddenly started roaring. His grip on Zoe's jacket remained firm, but his posture shifted slightly as he processed this unexpected development. For 6 weeks, Wren had absorbed his harassment without meaningful response, had accepted every humiliation and verbal assault with the kind of passive endurance that had reinforced his perception of her as a perfect victim. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just discovered an unexpected source of entertainment. "Ghost Girl finally found her voice. What are you going to do about it, skeleton? Call your mommy." The mockery was designed to deflate her moment of courage, to remind her of her social position and physical limitations, while reinforcing his own dominance in front of the growing crowd of spectators. Blake understood intuitively that public confrontations were as much about audience perception as they were about the actual conflict, and he was performing for the dozens of students who had stopped to watch this unprecedented challenge to his authority. Wren walked toward the group with steady, measured steps, her hands relaxed at her sides in a way that would have been recognizable to anyone with martial arts training, but appeared completely unthreatening to casual observers. For the first time in months, she felt the familiar calm settling over her mind, the state her uncle had taught her to find when conflict became unavoidable. The sensation was like slipping into a favorite piece of clothing that fit perfectly, comfortable, natural, and exactly right for the situation at hand. Her breathing slowed and deepened automatically, her posture straightened without conscious effort, and her awareness expanded to encompass not just Blake and his 2 companions, but every potential threat and escape route within a 20-foot radius. "I'm asking you nicely," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hallway. "Let go of her jacket and walk away." The tone was conversational, almost casual, but there was something underneath it that made several nearby students take unconscious steps backward. It was the voice of someone who was completely calm, completely focused, and completely committed to whatever action might be necessary to resolve the situation. Blake laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the lockers and seemed to bounce around the hallway like a physical presence. "Or what? You'll disappear on me." He gave Zoe's jacket another sharp tug, deliberately demonstrating his disregard for Wren's request while causing Zoe to stumble again. Tears of frustration and embarrassment were starting to form in Zoe's eyes, and Wren could see her friend's usual confidence crumbling under the weight of public humiliation and physical intimidation. The sight ignited something primal in Wren's chest, a protective fury that had nothing to do with her own safety and everything to do with defending someone who had shown her kindness when no one else would. "Or I'll make you let go," Wren replied simply. The crowd of students that had been pretending not to notice the confrontation suddenly found themselves openly staring. This was unprecedented territory. No one challenged Blake Morrison, especially not tiny girls who looked like they couldn't intimidate a house cat. The hallway had fallen completely silent except for the distant sounds of normal school activity from other corridors, creating a sense of theatrical tension that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something significant. Blake released Zoe's jacket and took a step toward Ren, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. His entire social identity was built around the assumption of physical dominance, the certainty that his size and strength made him untouchable by anyone who might challenge his behavior. The idea that someone like Ren might pose any kind of threat to him was so absurd it felt like a personal insult that demanded immediate correction. "You want to go, ghost girl? You want to dance? Let's see what you've got." He reached out to grab the front of Ren's jacket, probably intending to lift her off her feet or slam her against the lockers in a display of dominance that would reassert his authority and provide entertainment for the gathered crowd. The movement was confident and aggressive, backed by years of successful intimidation and the kind of physical superiority that had never failed to resolve conflicts in his favor. Instead, Ren's training took over with muscle memory that had been honed through thousands of hours of practice. She sidestepped Blake's reaching hands with fluid grace, her movement so smooth and economical that it looked almost like she was dancing rather than defending herself. Her hands came up to intercept his extended arm, her fingers closing around his wrist with a grip that was deceptively gentle but precisely positioned to control his movement and balance. Blake had expected resistance, perhaps a flinch, maybe an attempt to pull away or block his grab. What he got instead was someone who moved like water, flowing around his attack while redirecting his own momentum in ways that his brain couldn't process quickly enough to counter. Using his forward motion against him, Ren executed a textbook hip toss that Marcus had taught her during her second year of training. She pivoted on her left foot while maintaining her grip on his wrist, used her right arm to guide his upper body over her hip, and sent all 6'1" of Blake Morrison crashing to the hallway floor with an impact that seemed to shake the entire building. The throw was technically perfect, controlled, efficient, and devastating in its simplicity. Blake's body hit the linoleum with a sound like a falling tree, his breath exploding from his lungs in a whoosh that was audible throughout the hallway. For a moment, he lay there stunned, his brain struggling to process what had just happened to him. The crowd of watching students stood in complete silence, their mouths hanging open as they tried to reconcile what they had just witnessed with everything they thought they knew about social hierarchies and physical capabilities. Blake Morrison, the untouchable king of Roosevelt High, was sprawled on the floor looking up at a girl who weighed less than half what he did and stood almost a foot shorter. Tyler was the first to snap out of his shock, his wrestler's instincts kicking in as he processed the fact that his leader had just been humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses. His response was immediate and aggressive, a charging tackle designed to overwhelm Ren through brute force before she could demonstrate whatever fluke technique she'd used to floor Blake. But Ren had been training for exactly this kind of scenario since she was 12 years old. Multiple attackers, confined space, need to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently while minimizing her own exposure to injury. Tyler's charge was powerful but predictable, the kind of linear attack that was easy to counter if you understood leverage and timing. She waited until the last possible second, allowing Tyler to commit completely to his tackle before stepping aside like a matador, avoiding a bull. His momentum carried him past her, and she used the moment of his passage to guide him face first into the metal lockers with a precisely applied push that used his own force against him. The impact of Tyler's face against the steel doors created a sound like a gong being struck, followed by his muffled curse as he rebounded from the collision and stumbled backward, his hands coming up to check his nose for damage. Blood was already starting to trickle from his nostrils, and his eyes were watering from the impact. Mason hesitated for a crucial moment, clearly uncertain whether he wanted to be the next person to test this suddenly dangerous girl. His basketball player's instincts told him to be cautious, to evaluate the situation before committing to action, but that analytical approach cost him any advantage he might have had. Ren didn't wait for him to make up his mind. She closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps and delivered a precise strike to the nerve cluster in his shoulder, a technique Marcus had taught her for quickly disabling opponents without causing permanent injury. The strike was delivered with her knuckles at exactly the right angle and with exactly the right amount of force to temporarily disrupt the nerve signals controlling his arm. Mason's entire right arm went numb instantly, the feeling disappearing so suddenly and completely that he stumbled backward in panic, flexing his fingers and trying to understand what had just happened to him. The crowd of spectators pressed closer, their excited whispers rising as they processed the reality that Blake Morrison and his crew had just been systematically dismantled by someone they had dismissed as powerless. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but the reversal was so complete and so shocking that it felt like the whole world had shifted on its axis. Blake was still on the floor, propping himself up on his elbows while struggling to get his breathing back under control, his face red with exertion and humiliation. Tyler was slumped against the lockers, holding his nose and checking his fingers for blood while staring at Ren with an expression of bewildered fear. Mason was flexing his arm experimentally, trying to get feeling back into his shoulder while processing the fact that he had just been disabled by a technique he didn't understand and couldn't counter. Phones appeared as if by magic throughout the crowd, recording the aftermath of the confrontation with the kind of urgency that only came with witnessing something genuinely historic. Everyone present understood instinctively that they had just seen the end of an era at Roosevelt High, the moment when Blake Morrison's reign of terror had been definitively ended by the last person anyone would have expected to challenge him. Ren stood in the center of it all, her breathing calm and controlled, not even winded, despite having just taken down 3 athletes who collectively outweighed her by more than 200 pounds. Her posture remained relaxed but alert, ready to respond if any of them chose to continue the confrontation, but also projecting the kind of quiet confidence that made it clear she was exactly where she wanted to be. She looked down at Blake, who was finally starting to push himself up off the floor, his movements slow and uncertain as he struggled to process what had just happened to him. His Letterman jacket was torn at the shoulder, his carefully styled hair was disheveled, and his face bore the kind of dazed expression that came with having your fundamental assumptions about the world violently readjusted. For a moment, Ren saw herself as her uncle had trained her to be, a weapon, someone capable of inflicting serious damage on anyone who crossed her or threatened people she cared about. Blake was vulnerable now, off balance and struggling to regain his footing, his defenses completely compromised by the shock of his defeat. She could have ended the confrontation with a strike to his throat that would have left him gasping for air, could have delivered a knee to his face that would have required medical attention, could have demonstrated just how much damage someone with her training could inflict when the safety restrictions of practice were removed. For 8 years, Marcus had trained her to recognize and exploit exactly these kinds of opportunities, to press advantages when they appeared, and ensure that threats were neutralized completely and permanently. Instead, she took a step back and extended her hand to help him up. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything the watching students expected, that it seemed to create its own moment of stunned silence. Here was someone who had just demonstrated devastating fighting capability, offering assistance to the person who had been tormenting her for weeks, showing mercy when everyone present expected retribution. "We're done here," she said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the hallway despite its conversational volume. "All of us. This doesn't happen again." Blake stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how the former king of Roosevelt High would respond to this unprecedented gesture of mercy from someone he'd spent weeks tormenting. The hand that had been offered to him represented more than just physical assistance. It was an opportunity for dignity, a chance to end this confrontation without further humiliation, a pathway back to some semblance of social standing despite his comprehensive defeat. But accepting it would also require acknowledging that his victim had become his superior, that someone he had dismissed as powerless had chosen to show him compassion he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. The internal struggle was visible on his face as competing impulses battled for control. His natural arrogance demanded that he reject any assistance from someone he still wanted to see as beneath him, but his practical intelligence recognized that Ren was offering him something precious: the chance to walk away from this disaster with some fragment of his reputation intact. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat, and he accepted her help getting to his feet. His hand was shaking as it closed around hers, and she could feel the tremor of someone whose entire worldview had just been forcibly readjusted. He dusted off his Letterman jacket with unsteady movements, his face still flushed with embarrassment. But when he met Ren's eyes, there was something different there. Not friendship exactly, but a grudging respect that hadn't existed before. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse and uncertain, barely more than a whisper that somehow carried throughout the silent hallway. "We're done." The words seemed to release the tension that had been building in the watching crowd, and conversations resumed in excited whispers as students began to process what they had just witnessed. Tyler and Mason gathered themselves up without a word, their own humiliation complete as they flanked their defeated leader. No longer the confident predators they had been 5 minutes earlier, but rather shell-shocked followers trying to understand how their carefully constructed social hierarchy had collapsed so completely and so quickly. The three of them walked away through the crowd of students who parted like the Red Sea to let them pass, and Ren knew instinctively that this particular dynamic would never be repeated. Blake's power had been built entirely on the perception of his physical dominance and social untouchability, and both of those foundations had been destroyed in front of an audience that would ensure the story spread throughout Roosevelt High within hours. Zoe appeared at her side the moment Blake's crew had disappeared around the corner, her eyes wide with amazement and gratitude. She had retrieved her backpack from the floor where it had fallen during the initial confrontation, but her hands were still shaking as she processed what had just happened. "Ren, that was incredible," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and relief that made Ren's chest tighten with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. "Where did you learn to do that? I mean, I knew you were tough, but that was like something out of a movie." My uncle taught me," Ren replied simply, finally allowing herself to smile as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of what she'd accomplished started to sink in. "He always said the best fight is the one you don't have to finish." The philosophical observation seemed particularly relevant as she watched the crowd of students gradually disperse, their excited conversations following them as they headed to their final classes of the day. She could hear fragments of their discussions, speculation about where she had learned to fight, amazement at Blake's defeat, questions about what this might mean for Roosevelt High's social dynamics going forward. But the tone was completely different from the whispered conversations that had followed her through these same hallways for the past 6 weeks. Instead of dismissive snickers or carefully averted gazes, she heard respect in their voices, curiosity about this quiet girl who had just redefined the social order of Roosevelt High with a 30-second display of skill and restraint. More importantly, she saw changes in how they looked at her. The careful indifference that had characterized most students' interactions with her was replaced by something that felt like recognition, not necessarily friendship or social acceptance, but acknowledgement that she existed, that she mattered, that she was someone worthy of attention and consideration. Word of the confrontation spread through Roosevelt High with the speed that only high school gossip could achieve. By the time Wren reached her final class of the day, her American history teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was looking at her with an expression of curious speculation that suggested the news had already reached the faculty lounge. Other students in the class were sneaking glances at her throughout the period, and she could hear whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she turned in their direction. The walk to the bus stop after school was completely different from any she had experienced during her time at Roosevelt High. Instead of the careful invisibility she had cultivated for months, she found herself the center of attention from dozens of students who wanted to be seen, acknowledging the girl who had defeated Blake Morrison. Some of the attention was simply curiosity, but much of it carried undertones of respect and even gratitude from students who had suffered under Blake's harassment over the years. "Hey, Wren," called Jennifer Walsh, a sophomore who had been one of Blake's frequent targets earlier in the semester. "That was amazing what you did today. He had it coming for a long time." Similar comments followed her throughout the afternoon and evening as social media amplified the story far beyond the original witnesses. The videos that had been recorded during the aftermath showed Blake on the floor, Tyler holding his bloody nose, Mason flexing his numb arm, and Wren standing calmly in the center of it all, looking like she had just completed a routine task rather than accomplished something extraordinary. By Monday morning, the story had taken on mythic proportions, with some versions claiming that Wren had thrown Blake through a window or that she was secretly a ninja trained by an ancient master. The truth was somehow both more and less dramatic than the rumors. She was just a girl who had learned to defend herself and finally chosen to do so when someone she cared about was threatened. But the social impact was undeniable and immediate. Blake and his crew maintained a careful distance from both Wren and Zoe in the weeks that followed, their swagger replaced by a kind of wary caution that was visible to everyone at Roosevelt High. Other students began approaching Wren with a new kind of respect, some asking about martial arts training, others simply wanting to be associated with someone who had stood up to the school's most notorious bullies. The shift in social dynamics went far beyond just Wren's personal experience. Blake's defeat had created a power vacuum that changed how students interacted with each other throughout the school. Without his crew's systematic harassment campaign, several previously targeted students found themselves able to move through Roosevelt High without constant fear of humiliation or intimidation. Marcus Davis, a freshman who had been one of Blake's favorite targets because of his small size and academic focus, suddenly found himself able to walk through the hallways without being shoulder-checked into lockers. Sarah Kim, a junior who had been mocked relentlessly for her thrift store clothing and her family's financial struggles, discovered that the cruel comments about her appearance had stopped entirely. The change wasn't limited to Blake's former victims. Students throughout Roosevelt High began to understand that the social hierarchy they had accepted as immutable wasn't actually as permanent as it had seemed. If someone like Wren could challenge and defeat someone like Blake, then perhaps other assumptions about power and status deserved re-examination as well. The administration's response was more complicated. Principal Hendricks called Wren to her office on Tuesday morning, ostensibly to discuss the confrontation and ensure that there wouldn't be any repeat incidents. But the conversation was more cautious and respectful than Wren had expected, suggesting that the adults at Roosevelt High were also processing the implications of what had happened. "I understand there was an altercation on Friday afternoon," Principal Hendricks said, her tone carefully neutral as she reviewed what appeared to be witness statements from several students. "Multiple sources indicate that Blake Morrison and his friends were harassing another student and that you intervened to stop the harassment." Wren nodded, uncertain where the conversation was heading, but prepared to defend her actions if necessary. She had expected to be suspended or disciplined for fighting, but Principal Hendricks seemed more interested in understanding what had happened than in assigning blame. The witnesses all agree that you used minimal force and showed restraint even after you had clearly gained control of the situation, the principal continued, consulting her notes. They also agree that your actions were defensive in nature and that you attempted to resolve the conflict peacefully before it became physical. The careful language suggested that the administration had consulted with the school district's legal counsel before deciding how to handle the situation. Fighting was normally grounds for suspension, regardless of the circumstances, but Wren's actions fell into a gray area that made standard disciplinary procedures complicated to apply. Blake Morrison has been a student at Roosevelt High for 4 years, Principal Hendricks said finally. This is the first time anyone has been able to provide credible testimony about his behavior toward other students. I want you to know that we take harassment seriously and that we appreciate students who are willing to stand up for each other when they see others being mistreated. The subtext was clear. The administration was grateful that someone had finally provided them with a justification for addressing Blake's behavior, which had been an open secret among students and faculty for years. His defeat had given them the political cover they needed to implement disciplinary measures that would have been difficult to justify based solely on rumors and complaints that hadn't been witnessed by reliable sources. However, Principal Hendricks continued, I need to ask about your martial arts background. The techniques you used were clearly the result of significant training, and I want to make sure you understand the legal and ethical implications of using those skills in a school environment. Wren spent the next 20 minutes explaining her training with Marcus, emphasizing the defensive nature of what she had learned and her uncle's teachings about restraint and de-escalation. Principal Hendricks listened carefully, asking questions that suggested she was both impressed by the quality of Wren's training and relieved that it had been grounded in ethical principles rather than aggressive violence. The conversation ended with what amounted to a warning disguised as advice. Wren was free to continue her education at Roosevelt High without any formal disciplinary action, but she was expected to maintain the same level of restraint she had shown during the confrontation. Any future incidents would be evaluated based on whether her actions remained proportional and defensive in nature. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Blake appeared at Wren's locker as she was packing up her books at the end of the school day. She tensed automatically, her body preparing for another potential conflict, but his posture was completely different from their previous encounters. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands visible and non-threatening, and his expression was uncertain rather than aggressive. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the swaggering confidence that had characterized his movement through Roosevelt High's hallways for 4 years. In its place was something that looked almost like vulnerability, as if his defeat had forced him to confront aspects of himself that he had never had to examine before. "Hey," he said awkwardly, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. I should probably... He stopped and took a deep breath, looking more uncertain than Wren had ever seen him. "I'm sorry for all of it. The way I treated you, the way I treated Zoe, all the other people I've been a jerk to over the years." The apology was halting and imperfect, but it seemed genuine in a way that surprised her. Blake Morrison had built his entire identity around never showing weakness or admitting fault, and the fact that he was willing to acknowledge his behavior suggested a level of self-reflection that she hadn't expected from someone she'd assumed was incapable of growth. "You could have really hurt me that day," he continued, his voice dropping to a volume that wouldn't carry to other students in the hallway. Tyler's nose was messed up for a week, and Mason couldn't move his arm normally for 3 days. But you pulled your punches, didn't you? You could have done a lot worse to all of us. Ren studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only genuine confusion and what appeared to be gratitude. Blake Morrison was clearly struggling to understand how showing mercy to defeated enemies could be more powerful than crushing them completely. And the concept seemed to be reshaping his understanding of strength and weakness in ways that were both uncomfortable and necessary. "Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were," she replied simply, choosing her words carefully. "Even you." He nodded slowly, as if testing the weight of that concept. "Tyler and Mason, they're talking about transferring schools. They think everyone here sees them differently now, and they can't handle the way people look at them." "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Ren said, considering the implications. "Maybe it's a chance for them to figure out who they want to be when they're not following your lead." Blake winced at the observation, but he didn't argue with it. The idea that his leadership had corrupted his friends, as well as himself, was clearly something he was still processing, another uncomfortable truth that his defeat had forced him to confront. "What about you?" he asked, changing the subject to something that seemed safer. "Are you going to join the martial arts club or something? Everyone's talking about how you should teach self-defense classes, help other kids learn to protect themselves." Ren considered the question seriously. For months, she'd been trying to build a life that didn't revolve around her fighting skills, attempting to prove that she could exist in the world without relying on her ability to hurt other people. But the events of recent weeks had shown her that running from that part of herself wasn't the answer either. The martial arts training Marcus had given her wasn't just about physical techniques. It was about confidence, discipline, awareness, and the ability to make rational decisions under pressure. These were skills that could help other students navigate the complex social dynamics of high school, not just the extreme situations where physical self-defense became necessary. "Maybe," she said finally, "but only if it's about helping people protect themselves, not about hurting others." "There's a difference?" Blake asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "There's always a difference," Ren replied, echoing one of Marcus's favorite teachings. "The difference is in knowing when to stop." Blake nodded again, more confidently this time, and Ren could see him processing this new way of thinking about power and strength. The conversation continued for several more minutes, covering topics that ranged from college applications to family relationships, and she was struck by how different he seemed when he wasn't performing for an audience of followers and victims. Without the armor of his social status and the need to maintain his reputation for cruelty, Blake revealed himself to be someone capable of introspection and growth. He was still arrogant and entitled in ways that would probably take years to fully address, but the foundation was there for becoming someone better than he had been. He thanked her again before leaving, awkwardly but sincerely, and walked away with the kind of careful dignity that suggested he was still learning how to exist in a world where his physical dominance and social status couldn't solve every problem for him. The rest of her senior year at Roosevelt High passed with a kind of quiet respect that Ren had never experienced before. She did end up helping to start a self-defense club, working with the physical education department to develop a curriculum that emphasized awareness, de-escalation, and escape techniques rather than aggressive combat skills. The club attracted a diverse group of students, from former victims of bullying who wanted to build confidence to athletes who were interested in expanding their training beyond their primary sports. Ren found that teaching gave her a way to honor Marcus's lessons while helping others develop the same sense of inner strength and composure that had served her so well. Zoe became her closest friend and eventually her girlfriend. their relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than social convenience or shared trauma. Zoe's natural leadership abilities complemented Ren's more reserved approach to problem-solving, and together they became advocates for students who were struggling with harassment, social isolation, or academic challenges. The romance had developed gradually over the months following the confrontation, growing from friendship into something deeper as they spent more time together and discovered how well their personalities complemented each other. Zoe's confidence and social skills balanced Ren's introspective nature, while Ren's calm strength provided an anchor for Zoe's more energetic approach to life. Their first kiss happened during a study session in the library, when Zoe had looked up from her calculus homework to find Ren watching her with an expression of such open affection that the next step felt inevitable. The relationship remained mostly private during their senior year, not because they were ashamed, but because they both valued the intimacy that came with keeping something precious away from the scrutiny of high school social dynamics. Most importantly, Ren learned that her uncle had been right about more than just fighting techniques. The strongest person in any conflict wasn't necessarily the one who could inflict the most damage, but the one who knew when mercy was more powerful than violence, when showing restraint took more courage than throwing a punch. Standing up for yourself didn't mean becoming a bully. It meant finding the strength to protect what mattered while refusing to let that strength corrupt who you chose to be. The lesson had taken her 8 years to learn and 4 months to apply, but the understanding would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. As graduation approached and she prepared to leave Roosevelt High behind, Ren reflected on how much her perspective had changed since those early days when she had tried so desperately to remain invisible. The girl who had walked into Roosevelt High in August had been running from her own strength, convinced that power inevitably led to corruption and that the only way to be good was to be powerless. The young woman who would walk across the stage to receive her diploma had learned that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when force was necessary and the character to stop the moment it wasn't. She had discovered that hiding from who she was didn't make her safer or better. It just made her smaller. Marcus had been right, as he usually was. The training hadn't been about creating a weapon. It had been about forging someone strong enough to choose peace from a position of strength, rather than accepting it from a position of weakness. And in the end, that made all the difference. The graduation ceremony took place on a warm June evening, with families filling the football stadium to watch their children complete this phase of their educational journey. Ren walked across the stage to receive her diploma with Thomas and her mother cheering from the stands, their pride evident even from a distance. Blake Morrison was called to the stage 3 names before her, and as he passed her in the lineup, he nodded with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that would have been impossible to imagine 8 months earlier. He had grown several inches taller during their senior year, but somehow he seemed smaller, more human, less like the impossibly threatening figure he had been during those early weeks of harassment. Tyler Santos and Mason Reed had indeed transferred schools, as Blake had predicted, but they had both reached out to Ren through social media during the spring to apologize for their role in the harassment campaign. Their messages had been brief and awkward, but they seemed genuine in their regret and their recognition that their behavior had been wrong. As Ren walked across the stage and accepted her diploma from Principal Hendricks, she thought about all the paths that had led her to this moment. The divorce that had shattered her family, the training that had given her strength, the decision to hide that strength, and finally, the choice to use it in service of protecting someone she cared about. The future stretched out before her like an open road, filled with possibilities that hadn't existed when she was still trying to be invisible. She had been accepted to several colleges with generous financial aid packages, had developed friendships that would last beyond high school, and had discovered talents and interests that would shape her career choices for decades to come. But most importantly, she had learned who she was when tested, had discovered that she could be trusted with power and that strength could be a gift rather than a burden if it was guided by wisdom and compassion. The lessons Marcus had taught her in that converted warehouse in Portland had prepared her for challenges she hadn't even known she would face, and they would continue to guide her through whatever came next. As she walked off the stage with her diploma in hand, Ren caught sight of Zoe, waiting for her at the bottom of the steps, her smile bright enough to light up the entire stadium. Behind her, Thomas and her mother were making their way down from the stands, ready to celebrate this milestone with the family they had built together from the pieces of their separate lives. The girl who had tried so hard to be invisible had become someone impossible to overlook. Not because of what she could do to others, but because of what she had chosen to do for others. And in the end, that distinction made all the difference in the world.